We're going to talk about the basics of aftermarket AC tonight, how a system works, and the parts that you need, some installation tips, some things like that to keep you from making mistakes going in. That's what we're trying to solve and make you more comfortable in your vehicle that you're driving. Big thanks to Camaro Central, to Ben, to Sean, to the whole crew here for putting this whole thing together. Y'all are really fortunate to have an establishment like this to come and find parts and have quality advice, have good tech guys that can help you get the right parts and everything. A lot of areas don't have that, so y'all are really fortunate to have a shop like this in town to have that advantage. So thanks to y'all again for having them and everything. So I always start off with, it's really important to understand how air conditioning works. And this is air conditioning in your vehicle, in your home, or it's anywhere else. When you've got an air conditioner, it's not just a box that's making cold air. Air conditioning is a series of components that when you set those components up properly and you use a refrigerant, those components work together to remove heat from an enclosed area, take that heat to the outside and then dissipate it, and then do the same thing. So we're not making cold air. We're removing heat from an enclosed area and then dissipating that heat outside. And why that's really important to think about and understand is you can have the best air conditioning system in the world. If your car is not sealed and insulated properly, that AC is not going to work. You know, if you've got, it's just like your house AC. That AC can be really good, but if you've got the windows and the doors open, it doesn't do a real good job of cooling the house, right? So it's the same way with an air conditioner. If you're bringing hot air into the interior of your vehicle faster than that system can remove the heat from that air, you're never going to be satisfied with that system. So in conjunction with any AC system you choose for your car, for your vehicle, you've got to be thinking about sealing and insulating the vehicle at that point. That's hand in hand. If you don't do the first part, the second part's not going to work optimally. So that's really important to keep that in mind when you're doing it, okay? When you're thinking about components, you're thinking about kits, you're thinking about parts. Did y'all get, before we start, too, get those passed out? Pass those out. We got outlines for y'all to take with you. I start with this slide, and you're going to look at this and say, what does this have to do with air conditioning? What does this slide have to do with air conditioning, right? And I saw this on the internet years ago and I stole it. There's not a more simple device than a baseball cap, right? What was a baseball cap designed for? To keep the sun out of your eyes, right? You can put all the engineering, you can put all the design work into a product, but in the end, it always comes down to the guy doing the installation. And it's the same thing here. This guy here has got the simplest device in the world. His buddies next to him have figured out how that device works. They're holding their beers, they're watching the game. This guy, his main concern was looking cool rather than using these parts to get the best function out of his. And that's true with anything you do to your vehicle, whether it's air conditioning, whether it's brakes, whether it's things on the engine, improvements to the engine. It all comes down to the guy doing the installation. If you don't follow the instructions, if you don't follow the basic rules of physics, you're not going to have satisfactory operations out of your systems. Okay. We're going to talk about just what the basic components of an air conditioning system, aftermarket air conditioning system are. And then we'll just kind of point out the components and talk about what they do. Right? The first part of an air conditioning system is a compressor. And that compressor is nothing more than a pump. And until you engage the clutch on that pump, it's nothing but an idler pulley. And we got a compressor here. And this is a standard compressor, but this is what's known as an axial compressor. For years, people have called these a rotary compressor. There's some different kinds of compressors. Those of you all that have messed with things for a long time, remember the old York Tecumseh compressors? They were basically a lawnmower engine. And I mean, they're very efficient compressor. They just moved a lot of refrigerant. They just made a lot of vibration, made a lot of noise. And then a second design is the rotary. And that's like the GM pancake. They call it a pancake compressor, that R4. And that R4 compressor is almost like a radial aircraft engine. It's got a central crankshaft, and then the pistons splay out from that. And that's a rotary compressor. These compressors, people call these a rotary. This is actually an axial compressor. And what you've got, you don't have a crankshaft in this. You've got a wobble plate that's here. And then the pistons, you can see the cylinders on the body of this. The pistons are going back and forth this way. So here's the head, your suction and discharge. But again, until you put 12 volts to this electromagnetic clutch on the front of this compressor, this is nothing but an idler pulley. It's got sealed bearings, and where that comes into play is a lot of questions we'll get. Is it okay to drive my car with air conditioning before it's charged? And as long as you don't engage the clutch, you can drive it all day long. It's not going to hurt anything. So that clutch is what engages the compressor. When that clutch snaps in, now you've engaged. That wobble plate turns, it moves those pistons back and forth, and you're moving refrigerant through the system. All right, so that's what your compressor does. It basically just moves the refrigerant through the system. All right, the next part, you've got the discharge hose going into your condenser. And your condenser is going to sit in front of the radiator in 99% of the time. That's the best place for it. And that condenser is nothing but a heat exchanger. And we'll talk about what it does. But that's a heat exchanger. This is where the heat gets dissipated to the outside of the vehicle. All right? From the condenser, we're going to move into receiver dryer. And we'll talk about that shortly, what the receiver dryer does in these systems. And then from the receiver dryer, we're going to go in through our high pressure liquid line here into the expansion valve and into the actual evaporator inside the car. And the evaporator is the air conditioning box inside the car. That's called the evaporator. And there's a reason for that. We'll talk about it because your evaporation takes place. And then from the evaporator, we're going to come back through our low pressure suction line back to the compressor. Okay? And the way your air conditioning system works, and I'm going to give you the 3-minute discussion on this because any more than that's going to put you to sleep. But you don't need to know any more than this. But the way an air conditioning system works is you're pumping a refrigerant through the system. Your compressor pumps a refrigerant through the system. And that refrigerant changes state twice. When it evaporates from a liquid to a gas, it absorbs heat. When it condenses from a gas to a liquid, it dissipates heat. Okay? Evaporation takes place inside the vehicle, inside your evaporator. That's where you're absorbing the heat. And then the condensation takes place in the condenser, and that's where you're dissipating it. So what we're going to do now, we're going to take those same components and we're going to take them out of the car so you get a little better look at what they do. Okay? And again, I'm not going to get too technical here. We could talk, you've probably heard the term superheat. You've heard all of that and everything. You don't need to know any of that. Just the basics of how it works. Right? The colors of the diagram here, the red is high pressure and the blue is low pressure. So starting with the compressor, we're going to have a high pressure gas that we're going to pump into the condenser, and that refrigerant flows through that condenser, and as the air goes through, you're going to take and you're going to obviously lower the temperature, going to dissipate the heat away from that refrigerant in a gaseous state, then it's going to change state, it's going to condense into a liquid. So it becomes a high pressure liquid. Now we're going to take that high pressure liquid, we're going to push it through a receiver dryer. We'll talk about that in a second. That receiver dryer, then we're going to have nothing but high pressure liquid go into our expansion valve. Okay, and that expansion valve, what the expansion valve does, I'm going to make it really simple. You know, if you're watering your grass and you got a hose, right? If you turn up the strength of that hose water without anything on the end, it just kind of comes out in a stream, doesn't it? Then if you take your thumb and you squeeze down over the edge of that hose, you can turn that stream into a spray, right? You can turn that into a real fine mist. That's basically what your expansion valve is doing. That's taking that high pressure liquid and it's turned it into a spray. Now those spray droplets go through the coil. As they go through the coil, you're pulling hot air in from the vehicle into the blower motor, blowing that hot air across this coil, and as those little droplets evaporate from a liquid into a gas, they absorb heat. So now you've got the absorbed heat from inside. So on the other side of that coil, the air is cooler, right? Because you've taken, so basically what you have on the other side of that coil, what's blowing out on you, is air with an absence of heat. We call that cool air, but it's air with an absence of heat. There's no such thing as cool air. You've got hot air and you've got air that's not hot. So you've got air with an absence of heat. That's what you feel like. That's what you feel blowing on you, that's cooling you off. And the other added bonus you get from that, once you're taking the heat out of that air, is cooler air does not have the ability to hold humidity, right? You see that every morning in a humid environment like we live in, y'all live in here, and like I live in South Texas, same type of thing. You go to bed at night, your car's sitting outside, come out in the morning and it's got water all over it. Well, it didn't rain. Where's the water coming from? Well, the water comes from the humidity, the moisture that was in the air as it cooled overnight. That air could no longer hold that much humidity. It can't hold that. So that humidity becomes a liquid again, falls on any surface. So that's what that water is. The same thing's happening inside your coil. So that air you feel, not only is it an air with an absence of heat, it's an air with an absence of humidity, so it feels really cool and bitey on you. That's what gives you that nice bite as it's hitting you, because it doesn't have any humidity in it as well. So now we're going to pull that air, or that refrigerant, through the suction line into the compressor. That's a low pressure gas. We're pulling it out of there. And we're going to compress it to a high pressure gas, push it to the condenser, and start the whole cycle over again. And that's basically what you're doing with an air conditioning system. Okay? And the other thing about this, the great thing about this is, if you take these components and you set them up in a proper manner and you use the right amount of refrigerant, they have to work. It's just physics. It's basic physics. If it's not working, you got to figure out what have we done wrong, or what component isn't working properly. Because when the components are right, the refrigerant charge is right, it's got to work. You know, it's like holding up a hammer here and then dropping it. You know it's going to hit the floor. Okay? To give you a little better idea of how that evaporation takes place, y'all ever go to a restaurant where they have misters outside, you know, where they're trying to make it cooler for you while you're waiting to go into the restaurant? At that point, they're taking water and they're turning that water into a refrigerant. They're spraying, not necessarily you, but they're spraying a mist of water, and as that water evaporates, it absorbs the heat. So you feel cooler. So you're kind of getting the same effect out of those misters that you're getting out of your air conditioning system. And that's how it's working. Those droplets absorb heat as they evaporate. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Good. All right, let's kind of go back and talk about our components again for a few seconds. We'll add a couple more to it. All right? So now we've got our high pressure gas. We're going into the condenser, and we're taking that condenser, we're pushing ram air through it, either through a fan or through going down the road. So you got ram air coming into the front of the car, taking the heat out of it. Now you've got a high pressure liquid coming out of here. We'll take that high pressure liquid, and here's a cutaway, a receiver dryer. And the receiver dryer does several different functions for you within this system. And the system we're talking about here is, this is an expansion valve receiver dryer system. This is a little bit different than some of the later model cars that have a fixed orifice tube and an accumulator. You know that big silver container that you see, that big aluminum silver container? That's an accumulator. It actually goes in this suction line. It doesn't have a variable expansion valve. So the systems we're talking about here have a variable expansion valve, and that's what you're going to get. Any vintage air system, any of these aftermarket systems, you're going to get that variable expansion valve. That's a more precise way of metering the amount of refrigerant that goes into your coil. That's a better way to do it. You know why a lot of the OEMs don't? It's more expensive. It's more precise parts. It's easier to just do a fixed orifice tube than instead of having a variable expansion valve here, you just have a little thing with a hole in it. So it's cheaper. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about our receiver dryer here. Okay? We said it performs several different functions for you. You'll see that every receiver dryer has an inlet and an outlet. You can't reverse it. It'll be stamped in. And that stamp on in means that's the inlet. I can't tell you how many times through the years I have looked at guys' cars with things and I'll see it in backwards and I'll ask the guy and I said, that's the inlet. He said, no, that means towards the inside of the car. No, it's the inlet. Turn that around. And the reason they're directional is the inlet, you'll see here, the inlet, that high pressure liquid comes in, it flows down through the dryer here, and that's where you have the second function of the receiver dryer, is it's a filter. It has filter pads. And those filter pads will filter that refrigerant. As your compressor wears, that compressor has pistons, it has rings, you're going to get debris as the rings wear, and that's what that filter pad will catch. So that's a filter, number one. The second part of it is it removes any moisture from the refrigerant. You don't want any water in your refrigerant. You don't want any moisture. You want it just to be a pure refrigerant. So if there's minute amounts of refrigerant, or of water in the refrigerant, receiver dryer, the desiccant in that receiver dryer will absorb that water. And that desiccant is very, very similar. You know, if you buy a electronic product, a stereo or something like that you buy, has those little white packets in it. That's a desiccant, and that's to absorb it. So that's your second function of a receiver dryer, is that you're going to absorb any moisture in the refrigerant, because you don't want that any moisture in your refrigerant. The third thing the receiver dryer does for you is it provides a liquid seal so that we get nothing but liquid refrigerant going to the next stage, heading to our expansion valve. So you'll see the pickup tube is at the bottom of the receiver dryer. The level in the dryer when the system's charged properly is going to be about halfway full. So if you're halfway full, everything is picked up is going to be, it's going to be liquid, right? It's like taking a drink and putting a straw in it, right? As long as that straw is below the level of the liquid, you're going to get nothing but liquid with the straw. If you start pulling it up out of there, now all of a sudden you're taking vapor up too. So then we don't want that. We want pure liquid. So that's what putting that pickup tube below the level of the liquid keeps that as a complete liquid. Where that comes into play is people ask, how can I mount the dryer? Can I mount it laying down? Can I mount it on its side? How can I mount it? Well, I'll tell them, I always say, you got about 30 degrees. You got about 30 degrees of movement on that dryer. Anything more than that, you start running the risk of taking that drink and laying it on its side, and all of a sudden your straw is no longer buried in the refrigerant, right? So about 30 degrees, you're going to be good. Another question we get all the time is, where do I put the receiver dryer in the system, all right? It doesn't matter where in that high pressure liquid line that receiver dryer goes. It can be anywhere right at the outlet of the condenser to right before the inlet of the evaporator. Anywhere in this high pressure liquid line, you can put the receiver dryer. Anywhere. It doesn't matter. What you got to keep in mind is what you do want is to keep it away from heat. What are we doing with the condenser? Getting rid of heat, right? We're dissipating heat. We're taking heat out of that refrigerant. So what we don't want to do with a dryer is put it somewhere hot and put more heat back in the refrigerant. I always hate to see somebody mount it next to a header or next to an exhaust manifold or something like that, because you're just warming, that's a metal case, you're just heating up that metal case and you're making that refrigerant hotter and hotter. You want that refrigerant to as cool as it can be when it gets to that evaporator. The bigger temperature delta, the better it's going to absorb heat inside your vehicle, which is what you want it to do. So you want to keep that receiver dryer away from heat. When the OEMs started adding factory air as a more consistent option back in the 60s and everything, where did most of them put the receiver dryer? On the core support, right? Next to the condenser. That's where we do it on most of our SureFit kits. If there's room between the condenser and the grill next to it where you can fit that dryer up there in the grill area, that's where we want to put it. Because now you're in the airflow. You're getting cool air flowing on that dryer, so you're helping to keep that refrigerant cool. So again, you want to keep it away from heat. If you're working on a hot rod or something like that where you don't have a whole lot of grill area, 32 Ford, you're not going to put it next to the condenser. It's just not room. On a case like that, what I'll do is I'll put the receiver dryer inside the car, in the kick panel area. It's shielded from the heat. You know, it's out of the way. You don't see it. So that's a good place. If you don't have a place to put it, it doesn't have to be in the engine compartment. It can be in the interior of the car. It's going to get a little warm, but again, it's cooler inside the car. So that's a place you can think about putting that. Okay? Anybody have any questions on a dryer? Because that's a really important part of your system. Yes, sir.
They put sight glasses on the top of that, or is that?
They do. We're getting dryers, a lot of cases now that don't have a sight glass. And there's a reason for that. Back in the old days of R12, and we'll talk about refrigerant a little bit. Back in the old days of R12, when I first started doing air conditioning work, when we charged a system, you'd look at that little sight glass. How many people charged by looking at a sight glass in cars over the years? Just you? Come on. Yeah, come on. We got to do it. Come on. You used a sight glass, right? That wasn't the right way to do it then. But we did it. You got away with it. You got away with it. One of the biggest differences between 134A refrigerant and R12 refrigerant, I don't dwell much on this anymore because 12 is so far removed from what we normally do now. One of the biggest differences between those two refrigerants was the molecules of R12 were much, much bigger than the molecules of 134A. Much bigger. So when you were charging, looking at that little sight glass in the top of that dryer, you'd start putting in refrigerant, you'd keep putting in refrigerant till the bubbles went away, right? And at that point you said, okay, I've got pure refrigerant in here, we're all set to go, we're clean. Again, that wasn't the right way. The right way was to use the recommended amount, is the right way. But that's what we did. We got away with it, worked just fine. The problem with 134A, not the problem, but one of the chemical differences of it is the molecules are so much smaller that in addition to refrigerant circulating through your system, we also have refrigerant oil circulating through the system. From the compressor through the system, lubricates other parts of the system. It circulates in suspension with the refrigerant. The molecules of 134A are so small that the bubbles you see are actually oil bubbles. They haven't completely dissolved, they're just there. So the bubbles you see are oil. So if you put in refrigerant till there's no bubbles, what you've done is you've filled that dryer completely full of liquid refrigerant. Bubbles go away. Because it's all liquid at that point, but you got too much refrigerant. You get poor system performance. One of the biggest issues with system performance on any system with 134A or even and much so with a new YF1234 is charge. When you're using 134A refrigerant, you have to use the right amount. It isn't a guess. You've got to use the right amount. When we say 1.8, I mean 1.7 pounds to 1.8, it's got to be there. Any more than that, you lose performance. Any less than that, you use performance. You got to use the right amount. If you don't have a quality scale or a charging station or something like that, you're not going to charge that system as properly as it should be charged. You got to use the right amount of it. One of the things I do when I rent cars all the time, just paying attention to new car systems. Toyota's one I always look at. With a Toyota system, a lot of their systems I'll look at, they'll be 0.823 pounds plus or minus 0.02. Pretty tight tolerance, huh? That's how much difference an improper charge can make in a system operation. You've got to use the right amount of it. So that was a good question. Okay, continuing to talk about our system operation a little bit here too, all right? The next component of the system we need to talk about is the compressor safety switch. All right? And a compressor safety switch protects your compressor from damage and protects the rest of your system from damage. And what they'll do is if, again, we just talked about that oil circulates throughout the system in suspension with the refrigerant. So if we lose refrigerant, what else do we lose? Oil, right? So if we lose oil, things without oil don't run good. Any moving parts without some kind of lubrication. So, guys, you did 12 systems years ago. You remember we just had a low pressure switch? Low pressure switch used to go in there. What we used to do is have a low pressure, so when you charge a system, you're going to be around 30 psi before you start the system, just in a latent mode. So you're going to be a little higher than that. But a low pressure switch, what it would do is it would prevent the compressor clutch from being engaged if the system pressure was below 30 psi. Below 30 psi, can't turn the compressor on. That saves you from destroying the compressor in the system. Okay? That was a low pressure safety switch. Then we used to put a second switch in the system called a high pressure safety switch, and we'll talk about where those leads come from in just a second. But what a high pressure safety switch did is prevent your system from damage if the pressure got too high within the system. You've got a pump here in the compressor, and as long as that pump is turning, if the engine's going, as long as that's turning and you've got 12 volts to the clutch, it's going to be moving refrigerant throughout the system. If you don't remove the heat from the refrigerant, it's like any other gas. What happens to a gas when you heat it? It expands, right? Gases expand when you heat them. So if you're not getting rid of the heat in the system and you keep pumping that refrigerant through the system, you're going to build your pressure up really quick. Anybody ever been at an event where you've seen a guy blow a hose off an AC system? Bad deal, man. That's a bad deal. It'll make a mess. It'll dent a hood. It'll do anything. I remember going to Street Rod Nationals. I've been going to Street Rod Nationals forever. Used to be, back in the 90s and stuff, you'd see one a year at least. A guy had blow an AC hose off somewhere because he didn't have a safety switch in their system. A high pressure safety switch will disengage the compressor if the pressure in the system gets above 408 psi. Disengages the clutch, prevents you from damaging the system. So we used to have those two switches, a high pressure and a low pressure. Then manufacturers got a little smart and they combined those functions into a single switch. You know, if you've got two wings on an airplane, what's it called? A biplane. Two wheels on a bike? Bicycle, right? Okay? A binary safety switch is low pressure and high pressure protection for your system. If you're running an engine-driven fan for your primary cooling fan in your car, truck, vehicle, the very least you need is a binary safety switch. You need to have a binary safety switch in your system. Okay? If you're running an electric fan as your primary engine cooling fan, which more of us are all the time for a myriad of really good reasons, if you're running an electric fan, we want to use a trinary safety switch. And a trinary switch, tri is three. Tricycle is three wheels. Trinary switch has three functions. You have low pressure protection, high pressure protection, and a fan engagement signal. So below 30 psi, compressor can't be engaged. Above 408, compressor gets disengaged. And the third function, there's a separate function to that switch that at 254 psi, it sends a signal that said, hey, the pressure's high, fan needs to go on. You want to engage the fan with that. If you're running an electric fan on your vehicle as this primary cooling fan, I used to kind of waffle on this a little bit. You got to have a trinary switch. You got to. That's the right way to do it. We'll talk about brushless fans later. There's some things there too. But if you're running an electric fan as your primary cooling fan, you need to have a trinary switch. Invariably, I do a lot of these seminars through the years and have done a lot of through the years. But I guess, well, what do I need that for? I've got an engine temperature fan switch that when the engine gets the temperature, it turns the fan on. Okay, you're right, it will. The problem with waiting for that is, typical day, you're at a hot rod event, you're at work, you're anywhere else, it's hot, humid like it is here, like it is where I live. You go get in the car, what's the first thing you do after you start it? Turn the AC on high, right? I do. You want to get cooled off. Okay, so you're turning the AC on high. We're moving refrigerant throughout the system. We've got the refrigerant going. We're getting heat removed from the air. It's getting cooler inside the car. Where's our engine temperature? And you know thermostat yet. So what's going to happen if you just have a binary switch is That pressure is going to shoot up, and it's going to cut the compressor off. So now you're not going to be cool anymore because the compressor's off. It's not pushing refrigerant through the system. We don't want that. We want airflow. And by using a trinary safety switch, what you're doing is that you are allowing either your engine temperature or your AC pressure to tell you when you need more airflow. Right? It's telling you when you need more airflow. Either because of engine temperature or because of AC pressure. Whatever airflow there is, either you're not moving or something's happening, you're not getting enough airflow. We need that electric fan getting the airflow through that condenser. And that's what a trinary switch will do. And you'll see the wiring here for a trinary switch. We've got the power for our clutch to engage our compressor. It's either going to come from an AC thermostat or from the ECU. On most of our systems now, everything's through the ECU. You've got when you turn on the cool and you turn on your AC and you're asking for cool, you get a 12-volt signal that's generated. It goes out, goes through our safety switch here. Here's our 12-volt signal. We go into one side of our trinary switch, out the other side. So this side will be hot with that 12 volts. As long as our AC pressure is above 30 and below 408, this portion of the switch is going to be connected. It'll put that 12 volts out to the clutch, engage the clutch, start the compressor pumping. Okay? Here's the other side of the switch. That is your electric fan engagement signal. If you're using a standard electric fan, then we're going to have a relay, and either your engine temperature is coming and grounding that relay, a switch is coming and grounding that relay, or your AC pressure at 254 is going to ground that relay. Any one of those is going to ground that relay and give your electric fan the engagement signal to turn on and give you that airflow you need. Yes?
Do you have to have an electric fan, or can you still keep your own clutch fan?
Yeah, if you've got a clutch fan that's working good. No, if you've got a good clutch fan and a shroud, my daily driver is a 87 Monte Carlo. I drive it every day. I got vintage air in it. I got our Gen 5 in it, man. I love it. I may go to an electric fan, and I'll tell you, I did installations for many years, and I was an engine-driven fan guy back in the 80s. Man, if the motor's running, you got a fan. You're moving air, right? The problem with an engine-driven fan, in most cases, is when you need it the most, it's the least efficient. Because when do you need it the most? When you're idling, right? When you're idling and you're not moving much. At that point, it's at its least efficient operation. With a good, but back in the 80s, man, the fans that they had back then were not, in many, many cases, were not good enough to be primary fans. Most of them were auxiliary fans that were basically helpers. You had to have a good engine-driven fan. Now, there's so many good choices for electric fans that it only runs when you need it. Or when we talk about brushless fans, even more so, it only runs as high as you need it. Yeah, which is what all the OEMs have gone to now.
I just change my radiator to aluminum, and that way I don't run the air conditioning system over. And I took the condenser out because it's blocking so much air to the radiator. Or your condenser's more efficient or not more through.
Yeah, a parallel flow condenser is more efficient. But I'll tell you, and again, through the years I've had this, when I did installations and everything else, man, I put AC on the car and now it's overheating. Well, if your cooling system is efficient and working the way it should, AC should add 3 to 5 degrees. That extra heat load should add 3 to 5 degrees. That could be the straw that breaks the camel's back if your system's not running at peak efficiency. And I like a clutch fan. I like a clutch fan better than just a direct drive fan because it's quieter. That's the other bad thing about an engine-driven fan. I've got an engine-driven fan on my 32 that I've got with a shroud and everything. Problem is, man, it sounds like an F-16 at times. I mean, it's loud. It's loud. And that's the other drawback of an engine-driven fan. They're just loud. If they're moving air, they're going to be loud. Any fan that moves air is going to be, you're going to hear it. It's doing work. It's going to hear it. So in answer to your question, no, I'm not saying you can't use, because I got a clutch fan on my Monte Carlo, works just fine. Works just fine. But it's big, it's a 19-inch, full shroud, so you're getting full efficiency out of that engine-driven fan, and it's viscous, so then it's only engaged when you need it.
Well, I done 3/4. Would I have to go forward to do there, or were you saying?
With your radiator, it depends. You might, a lot.
If it's 20 degrees, it runs 150 on a cool day, 180 on
Yep.
So I can afford it at 7 degrees.
Right. Yep. If it's efficient, the first question I always ask when a guy talks about overheating is, the first question is always, when is it overheating? Is it overheating in low speed when you're going slow, or is it overheating when you're going down the highway? If it's overheating when you're going slow, it's an airflow. It's airflow. Because you're at idle, you're generating less heat. The engine's generating less heat at idle than it is when it's spinning at 2,500 RPM or 2,000 RPM or whatever. When you're making horsepower, you're making heat. So if you're going down the highway, 2,000 RPM, you're making more heat. If you're able to cool with that radiator, if that radiator has the capacity to cool it at going down the highway, you got enough capacity. If it's in the drive-through you're having it, now we've discovered you got an airflow problem. You got an airflow problem. You need more airflow. The engine's telling you if it's going up, I'm not getting enough airflow. Again, similar to this, you're not getting enough airflow through it to remove the heat. That radiator's a heat exchanger just like that condenser is, same thing. But any heat exchanger, it's always, you've got either a liquid or a gas that touches a tube. The tube transfers heat to the fin. Airflow or coolant flow goes across that fin and removes the heat from it. So lose one of those, if you don't have flow or if you don't have airflow, you don't have that heat transfer. That's the simplest way I can explain it. But that's always the first question I'll ask somebody if they've got it. If you're having problems going down the highway, you may not have enough radiator capacity for the amount of horsepower you're generating, for the heat you're generating. But if it's when you're going slow and it's okay going fast, the only difference is the amount of air coming in through the radiator. When you're going on the highway, you've got to ram air. And that's another reason when we talk about how we're going to run this fan with a trinary, I've had plenty of guys through the years tell me, well, I have my electric fan hooked up. I don't need a trinary. I've got that electric fan hooked up so that every time my compressor engages, every time that 12 volts comes to engage my compressor, I turn on the fan. So I've solved the problem without putting another switch in there. Okay, you have to a certain extent. But why would you run your fan when you're going down the highway at 70 miles an hour if you don't need to? By putting a trinary switch in there and an engine temperature switch, again, we're right back to that statement earlier, you're letting the engine or the AC tell you when it needs more airflow. I will tell you when you're going down the road at 70 miles an hour, my wife tells me to say, you need to be, that fan is probably going to be interrupting that airflow. If you're running an electric fan that's trying to pull air at a certain speed through that radiator and you've got ram air trying to go there, they tend to fight each other. You tend to create turbulence, and in many cases that's worse. So that's why you want to have switches that allow that make that choice for you. I had a guy at Louisville last year at the Street Rod Nationals. We went back and forth for 5 minutes, and he was telling me, you're wrong. This is the way to do it with a compressor. And I finally told the guys, you know what? It's your car. Everybody's building their car. It's your car. You can do it however you want. But I can't let you tell everybody else here that that's the right way to do it on their car, because it's not. So that's, again, I used to be a little more diplomatic than I am sometimes now. But again, what I'm trying to aim for here is for you to get the optimal operation out of your system. Good.
So is your trinary switch, is it variable speed or on and off?
Trinary is basically 2 sets of contacts, if nothing else. There is no variability to it. On the compressor side, above 30 psi and below 408, those 2 contacts are together. They allow that current to flow through and give you power to your clutch.
Power side or ground side?
Whatever your relay's set up for. On the fan side, this is going to be power, because you're putting, to engage that compressor clutch, this compressor clutch engagement signal, this has got to be 12 volts. You're putting 12 volts to this. So the compressor side of this is going to be 12 volts. Depending on how you have your fans wired, this switch doesn't care. Again, it's just two contacts. It doesn't care if it's 12 volts or if it's a ground. If you've got your electric fan set up so you're triggering it with a 12 volt signal like some do, you can put a 12 volt signal here instead of a ground, and all it's going to do is run that 12 volts to the relay. So however your fans are set up, this just becomes an option on here. It becomes a secondary connection on that engagement signal. If that engagement signal's a ground, you give it an extra ground. If it's a plus 12 volts, you give it plus 12 volts. On a brushless, that's what you'll do. Again, we'll talk about that. Okay. Any other questions on that?
I mean, just one breakout. So if a customer has vintage air on their car and a clutch fan, and they upgrade it to aluminum radiator and electric fans, we need to sell them a trinary switch.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. If you change from an engine-driven fan to an electric fan, you need to go to a trinary switch to get optimal operation of your system. Because if you don't have that trinary switch, and I'll get this question a lot from guys that are using snipers or any fuel injection system or anything like that, because they'll tell me, yeah, but my computer turns on my electric fan, right? Okay, that's true. But that computer doesn't know anything it's not being told. So if you've got a Holly system or if you've got anything else, it's being told by a sender what the engine temperature is, right? Okay, so it can react to that, and you can set it up in there. I want my fan to be engaged at 192 degrees. Okay, it'll do that. It'll send that signal. But without a trinary switch, how does it know what's going on here in the AC system? It doesn't. Without a trinary switch, that computer has no input. It has no idea what's going on in the AC system. So that's why you need to have the trinary switch in there, because even if you got a computer-controlled engine temperature, that computer is no different than a set engine temperature in its function. It's just giving you a signal to engage the fan. The only difference is you can adjust it when you want it to, but it's still just giving a signal. That make sense? Yes, sir.
I got a question. I put a LS in my own van. Look at the both fans. I put dual fans on it.
You put an LS in your Nova, okay, and you got a dual fan setup? Yep.
It's temperature control.
Yep.
One comes on with the other.
Yep.
So would you look at the both of them?
Now I'm going to put my little hat on that says opinion, right? I'm going to give you my opinion. When I used to do installs or anything else, to me, that's just like there's two-speed fans out there, right? Some people, they'll use a two-speed fan or anything else. To me, if I need airflow on a fixed fan, fixed electric fan, not a brushless, not a variable, but if it's just an on or off fan, if I need airflow, I want all I can get. So that means if I got two of them, I'm going to turn them both on. Why would I want to cool just half the radiator? Why would I want to get airflow just across half the radiator? If you need air, let's get air flowing across all the radiator, and then when the temperature comes down and when the pressure comes down, it'll cut them both off.
So would I have to go back and...
You'll have to join them together.
Okay,
You'll put a Y connector on those two fans.
okay, like where I've got them set different temperatures. That's set like, how would you do that? Like I said, just straight.
Yeah, I would just mechanically put the two power wires of the fan together and then put them to that same output. So whatever output you set it at, it's going to turn them both on.
So you bypass like the relays to...
No, you still got to do the relay, because that computer doesn't have the current capacity to handle a fan. All you're doing is on the fan side of the relay, you're going to join. Is it two relays or a single relay?
You got two relays.
You got two relays, okay.
You're going to bypass those.
Well, what you're going to do is you're going to make that one signal run both relays, so that you're engaging both fans at the same time. Yeah, again, that's the way I would do it. Again, if I need air, I want air. I want all I can get. I want all I can get. So that's what I would do. I think you'll be happier that way. Again, You got 2 fans on a radiator. If you need some cooling or you need some airflow, why would you want it through just half your radiator? You're basically throwing away this other capacity over here. Because without airflow, that's nothing but a water storage tank or a coolant storage tank. If there's no airflow through there, it's not dissipating any heat. You've just got a coolant storage tank, not a radiator. Make sense? Yep, good. What else? Questions?
A little bit of the week, what we do on the LS filtration, we actually run a transducer like a TM.
Yep.
And then that way it simplifies the wiring stuff a little bit. So that's what tells AC to get off and on.
Yeah, you're putting a pressure transducer in the system. Correct. Are you running brushless fans too? Just a stock fan. Okay.
So that way you only got one relay on the wire.
Right. But my first thing was, how does it know? Well, it knows because you got a pressure transducer there. So yeah, you're doing that. You're basically doing what a trinary does, just doing it with another part called a pressure transducer. Yep. Yep. Exactly. Which is fine. But again, you're feeding that computer input information, and then you can set it to when it engages the fan from that. That's correct. Yep. Yeah, you're doing that with that. And if he could do that on his if he has access to that, depending on what computer it is and what there is on that. I know Holly, the Dominator, I know you can.
We've done them on terminators and stuff too. Just run the
Yep.
TM.
Yeah.
Kind of tell it what to do.
Yep. Again, but as long as you're telling it, you're good. Yep, you're good with that. Couple quick tips now when we talk about this. All right. Again, these are things I've seen over the years and I continue to see through the years. We're taking a high pressure gas and we're going into our condenser. Here's a condenser. And all the condensers we use anymore, and what you're going to see on 99% of the vehicles, are what's called a parallel flow condenser. Does anybody remember the old tube and fin condensers that were in the 60s? The tube and fin was basically one continuous pass through there. Okay? And now we've gone to a parallel flow. And the way a parallel flow works is your refrigerant comes in here and there's dividers so that you bring that refrigerant in and it goes across through these tubes and then drops down and comes back through these tubes in parallel. That's why it's called a parallel flow. And you'll see as part of that parallel flow, this is kind of a cutaway of these tubes that are here. These tubes are separated into pathways, hallways. And the reason for that is by doing this, you dramatically increase the surface area on your heat exchanger. And increasing the surface area increases your heat transfer. Quick and dirty way to illustrate that. If you've got, we all did this as a kid, right? You got a hot stove and you go over the burner and you kind of put your hand above it, you can feel the heat, right? What happens when you touch it? It gets really hot, right? At that point, you've done heat transfer. You've transferred that heat and you do it the best by touch. So the more surface area a heat exchanger has, generally the better it's going to be. It's the same thing with a radiator. The more tubes, when they talk about how many cores, talk about how big the tubes are, the more surface area you have for contact, the more efficient the heat exchanger is going to be. But on a parallel flow condenser, one thing that's really important. Yes?
Does it matter if the orientation of the inlet and outlet is there?
Yes. Yes, and I'm going to talk about that right now. You got me right in there, exactly. You got a number 8 on the top and a number 6 on the bottom. The number 8 is coming from the compressor. That's the larger hose, and the number 6 on the bottom. The reason for this is we're putting a high pressure gas in the top, and then as we're running ram air through there, we're taking the heat away and we're condensing that gas to a liquid. Which is heavier, gas or liquid? Liquid. Is everybody awake? Still asleep? Liquid. Gas is lighter than liquid. Liquid's heavier. So if we take this, like you said, if we take this and flip this over, now we're putting the gas in the bottom, and as we condense that gas to a liquid, we're trying to push it up. So now you're trying to push a heavier substance uphill. It's harder. What happens when you do that? You increase pressure. You don't want higher pressure. So, and if you take this and lay it on its side, you run into the same thing. So in a parallel flow condenser, you always want the larger on top, smaller on the bottom. You know, it's like an ice cream cone. Big on top, small on bottom. I was doing a seminar one time and my wife said it was like when I was looking for a husband. I wanted big broad shoulders and a little bitty waist. Big on top, small on bottom. Easy way to remember it. Okay? Bigger on top, smaller on bottom. Little things like this, will this being an upside down, will that prevent the system from working? No. Putting the dryer in backwards, is it going to prevent the system from working? Nope. But it will affect the efficiency and the performance of the system. It makes the difference between having that really nice cold air and just having some cool air you're feeling. Like the right amount of refrigerant. Makes a big difference in operation of the system, of it being optimal. Okay? But that's a bit, I still see this. Man, I look at a lot of cars in the year. You know, guys will come in and they're having this problem, they're having that problem. I'll go out and look at a lot of cars. And this is something that's still common. Even more so when they'll put it on its side because the fittings are easy to get to on the bottom. They want to hide the fittings in the hoses. So they'll put it up, they'll put it vertically. Doesn't work. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little more about how the system works when we're doing it. Okay. Everybody got what we talk again? I don't get too technical with it, but that's a good explanation of how it works. That's a simple explanation of how you're doing it. Absorbing heat inside, dissipating it to the outside. Okay. Now, we talked about in our coil, as air, we pull in hot air, blow it across the coil, we remove that heat from that air, and as we remove the heat from the air, it loses the capacity to hold moisture. So as that air comes across the coil and it loses that capacity to hold the moisture, those moisture forms on the coil fins becomes droplets. And through gravity and through the help of the blower, that moisture, it's condensate, falls to the bottom of the case, and then it goes out through the drains at the bottom. Or it goes out on your feet if you didn't hook up the drain hose. That water, when you pull up at a gas station or you pull up somewhere and get out of the car, and there's a big old puddle of water under the car, that puddle of water isn't a leak, that water is the humidity that was in the air turned into a liquid, turned into water. So you've got to have that outside the vehicle. When you're running your drain hose outside the vehicle, what you want to do is make sure that drain hose goes down because of what? Gravity, exactly. You want it to fall off. Another thing I always do on a drain hose when I'm doing it is I'll back cut it at a 45-degree angle. Where it's hanging down, I'll cut the backside at about a 45-degree angle. And what that tends to do is you're running down the road, as the air rushes around that, you tend to create a low pressure area behind that, and it helps the water come out of it as you're running. So just kind of a little thing there that'll do that. I bought a brand new pickup in '88. At that time, they weren't called OBSs. They were just the new style pickup, right? I bought a new pickup in '88, and first new car I'd ever owned, truck. And I was driving it, and the AC started stinking inside. It was smelling inside. You know how you get that moisture smell and everything, that mildew smell? And I kept going into the dealership about it, and they go, well, it didn't take long to figure out. GM stuck the drain hose straight out of the firewall and didn't put a downspout on it. Didn't put an elbow and a downspout on. It was just sticking straight out of the firewall. So I did most of my driving on the highway then. I was on the road a lot, so I was on the highway all the time. And the air coming up that was not allowing for it. They finally, I found it and fixed it on mine, never thought about it because just tried it. They finally came out with a tech bulletin and they were recalling them and doing that on all of them. So that's something you got to think about when you're doing that. Just make sure that that drain hose falls, it's not plugged, and that your condensate's draining out of there. Because if it does not, what'll happen if you don't get the condensate drained out of here and it just starts building up, one of two things is going to happen. It's either going to freeze or it's going to block the air. You can't blow through water really well. It blocks the air trying to flow through the coil, and you're not removing heat from it. Okay. So you want to make sure your drains are falling. I can't tell you how many times I've found, and a lot of times I'll find guys that they've done it all right the first time, and then they take their car to get upholstered, and the upholstery guy doesn't like that hose just sticking there. So he just goes up over the top of his deal, and then, well, the water doesn't flow up good. So that's a common thing. It's a common thing with that. And then another little thing. Okay. With the drain. All right. Now, we're going to talk more about how the system works when it does it. Once we start the compressor, we're pulling air inside, we're pulling air through that blower in, blowing it across the coil, that air is getting cooler, and we're recirculating it. So every time the air goes through here, it gets a little cooler. It has a little less heat on it, right? I mean, that just makes sense. Unless your windows are down or unless the car is not sealed, as you continue to go here, that air is going to get cooler every time as it goes through there. And your coil temperature is going to continue to go down as that air gets cooler. We've got moisture in that coil, and you've got air getting cooler. And people, if you've heard about, I'm sure everybody's heard about freeze up, right? About your AC freezing up and everything. What happens when an AC system freezes up is if the coil temperature gets down below 32, you've got all those droplets of moisture on the fins, and now they start to become an ice crystal. Because below 32, those droplets freeze into an ice crystal. And if you ever built a snowman, what happens when you take a little bitty snowball and start rolling it around? It gets bigger, right? Same thing happens in your coil. As those crystals start to form, there'll be more and more and more. And you can finally turn this into literally a block of ice. You can turn that into a block of ice. And at that point, the system's froze up. That's an external freeze up. The system is frozen up. You can't blow air through it. So you're not removing the heat from the air anymore. You can't blow the air through it. So at that point, the only thing you can do to run your system again is turn it off, let the coil temperature get back above 32. That ice turns to liquid, it melts, goes to the bottom, goes out through the drains. Okay, now I can turn my system on and start over again. And one way you can always tell if you've got an external freeze up on your system is the blower will get really loud, but you're not feeling much air coming out your vents because it's trying to blow through a frozen coil. So the air you feel is going to be basically just stagnant, real stale feeling air. Because all you're getting is whatever air can be forced around the coil, under it or around it. And at that point, that's when you know the system's froze up. We don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. I mean, we don't want to wait till it's froze up and then turn it off and start over again, right? We don't do that. So what we'll do with the system is we'll monitor the temperature inside the coil, and then when the coil temperature gets down into the mid-30s, we're going to say, uh-oh, we don't want to keep getting colder, so we send a signal either through an ECU or through an external thermostat out to the compressor to shut off, to disengage. So we'll disengage the compressor, let that coil temperature come up a few degrees, and then re-engage the compressor at that point. And basically what that is, that's called cycling the compressor. So we'll turn the compressor off for a few seconds. Your coil temperature comes up a little bit, and then we'll turn the compressor back on. And so you maintain a fairly consistent temperature within your coil. right? On all our Gen 4, Gen 5 systems, that's all done through the ECU. In like under-dash units, and some of the old Gen 2 series that we had and everything, that was done with an external thermostat, a regular thermostat. So if you've got a vehicle that has 4 controls, and one of them is for cold and one is for heat, the cold one controls this thermostat. And on that thermostat, it has a capillary tube that goes down inside the coil. And that capillary tube is filled with a gas. And again, we get expansion and contraction of the gas. As the gas contracts, you have 2 contacts in that thermostat. And as it gets too cold, you can adjust it. It gets too cold, that separates and it disengages the compressor. On a thermostat system. On an ECU controlled system, that's all handled by the ECU. You don't have to think about that. We program our ECUs so that at about 37 degrees of coil temperature, the compressor disengages, and then at 46 it re-engages. There's no adjustment needed for it. But if you don't cycle the compressor, you're going to freeze up the coil at some point if your system's working right. I talked to a guy earlier, we were talking about, he said his compressor seems to cycle fairly quickly. And a lot of that depends, the length of that cycle depends on how tight your car is, because the quicker that compressor pulls, and your condenser pulls that coil temperature down, the quicker it's going to disengage to cycle, and then it'll cycle back on. So it may do it depending on how the system is, depending on the outside temperature, how quickly that temperature gets there. Cycling is a big part of the system working properly. So I mean, everybody understand what I'm saying with that? You've got to cycle it to keep it from freezing up. Okay. Okay. I'll spend some time talking about brushless fans. I will tell you, anybody here familiar with brushless fans? No. If you're running a late model vehicle with an electric fan, most likely it's a brushless fan. The OEMs went to that years ago. And I am a huge supporter of brushless fans. I believe in them. I've got a 39 Ford that I've had since 1984. Long time. I've driven that car 200,000 miles and stuff over the years. And one of the best things I ever did on that car is go to a brushless fan. I love the way it operates. The difference between a brushless and a brushed fan is a brushed fan has mechanical brushes, that's why it's called a brushless, and they ride on a commutator. When you put power to it, that spins, right? And it's either off or on. A brushless fan has a controller that has an ECU, that has a microprocessor, and it has a microprocessor built into the fan itself, into the fan motor itself. And there's no mechanical contact. It's all done in electric field. And the big thing is it's variable speed. So a brushless fan spins at the speed it needs to maintain a consistent engine temperature. But everybody's got a late model vehicle now. Most of us have a late model. I don't, but most of us have late model vehicles. If you watch the temperature gauge, and if you've got your hot rod and you've got an electric fan as your primary cooling fan, you ever watch the temperature gauge, how it works? I know you do. You watch the temperature gauge goes up to whatever the setting of your fan is, right? If your fan's set at 195, comes on at 195, at 195, the fan comes on. And in most cases, unless you got a good alternator, you'll watch your voltmeter drop as that brushed fan engages. Brushed fan comes on, it spins at max, brings that engine temperature down to about 185, 180, depending on what you want. And then what does it do? Turns off, right? And then if you're sitting in traffic, it does the same thing all over again. Your engine temperature builds up, We get to 195, the fan comes on, we bring it back down to 180, and the fan goes off. With a brushless fan, you've got an you've got a sending unit, you've got a microprocessor that senses engine temperature, and it's going to basically spin that fan at the RPM it needs to spin to maintain a more consistent engine temperature. Again, if you got a late model vehicle, you don't see your temperature gauge doing this most of the time, do you? It's much more consistent because of that brushless fan. It's spinning that fan at the RPM it needs to maintain a more consistent. So with a brushed fan, you're basically chasing engine temperature. And with a brushless fan, you're going to maintain a more consistent engine temperature and more consistent AC operation as well. Okay. Anybody got a brushless fan on their hot rod? Anybody use one here? Yeah. You like it? I love mine. I wouldn't do anything else on a vehicle anymore with a brushless fan if I was building one because I'm so happy with this, with the way it operates. With a brushless fan, you still use a trinary switch. And what the trinary switch will do, and again, this one now we're using 12 volts. So we've got our AC portion of it, same as we did up here. The AC portion here. But on the brushless, we're going to run 12 volts across it, and it feeds into that controller. And when the AC temperature gets up, the AC pressure gets up, it's going to send a signal to run that fan at about 80%. It'll kick the fan up to get your pressure back down, and then it'll go back to being variable. So you're still going to use a trinary switch with a brushless. You're just going to use it a little differently than you do with a brushed fan. Same principles though. And I am a huge supporter of brushless fans. They're expensive. That's the one, I don't even want to call it a drawback, but it's one thing that's different. A brushless fan is more expensive simply because of the complexity of it and the parts on it that make it more expensive. But man, I sure do like the way they work. Sure do like the way they work. They render your hot rod, your street rod, your muscle car much more new car-like than a regular electric fan. Another thing I want to talk about real quick is alternators. And this is another thing we've run into more and more as our systems increase in complexity with the electronic portion of our systems. You know, if you've got a 60s muscle car or anything and you're trying to run new accessories with the stock alternator and wiring, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Fuel injection, our system, you start getting below 10 volts, systems don't work. They start shutting down and they don't work properly. You need a minimum of a 100 amp alternator to start running electric components on your car, minimum. And the other thing that people rarely do, and I used to wire cars, a lot of them. I wired cars and did AC installation when I first met Jack, who founded Vintage Air. That's what I was doing. And you can't put a 100 amp alternator on an old car with a 10 gauge charge wire and expect it to work properly. You've got to upgrade the gauge of your charge wire. On our front runner drive systems, we make drive systems as well, our front runner drive system. We now use a 170 amp alternator, and that 170 amp alternator outputs about 140 amps at idle, the way we're spinning it. We include a 4 gauge wire with that to go to either the starter or directly to the battery so that you can carry that current capacity. Because trying to run, if you do that, and again, I've gone through, a guy on our road tour last year was having all kinds of problems, and I went and looked at his car. He had a 10 gauge wire coming out of a 100 plus amp alternator going. That wire was black at the alternator. It was so burned. And it's like trying to take a little bitty coffee stirrer and blow through it versus a regular straw. You've got to have that carrying capacity to be able to handle that amperage and everything. So that's another thing that's a big part of making your hot rod, your muscle car and everything work like a late model vehicle, is having a charging system and wires set up properly to do it. Another thing that's so critical these days, grounding. Good friends of mine at American Auto Wire, we talk all the time in this and everything. Guys at Holly, we go back and forth with some things. Probably one of the most common things is grounding issues. And you can't depend on a frame now, a 60-year-old frame, to be a good ground. If you're going to move your battery to the trunk, please run a good ground wire all the way up, join to the engine, then have a grounding lug where you can take grounds to and everything, so you've got a clear path. On our systems, our wiring harnesses, we put right on there, run directly to the battery. You know, if you're running lights that have 8, 10 amps, if you take away 20% of that because you don't have a good ground or good wiring, they still tend to work, incandescent lights. But if you've got systems that run on milliamps, on thousands of amps, and you take away 20% of it, you lose it. And you will chase those problems. They will be the most oddball problems. But grounding is huge with what you're doing on cars today too. That's a big part of that as well. Okay? Grounding and charge. And again, wire capacity. And when I'll just call you a quick story. When we first came out with our Gen 4 system for 57 Chevy years ago, 2001 I think it was, when we first brought out Gen 4. One of the first guys we sent it to was a friend of mine, and he was having all kinds of problems with the ECU shutting down and everything. And finally we went over, looked at his car and everything. It was a 57 Chevy, he had the original wiring harness on it, and out of the voltage regulator, all the insulation was cracked and falling off there. So he had EMI problems that was affecting our ECU. So we had to make some changes to our ECU to try to harden it against some of these EMI problems that are inherent with older cars and what's happened to them and everything. Another quick story, we had to learn some lessons on our systems. A lot of you may not know this, but we did the AC for the Ford GT. Design, development, manufacturing for the 2004, 2006, and the 2016 on and up into. We did full system development on that. And when we first started working on the first Ford GT, we were going back and forth to Detroit all the time working on this. It was a real tight, compressed time. And we had our prototype unit all set. Everything was good. We tested it. We did all that. We overnighted it to him. Engineer calls me the next morning, and he said, "Man, this thing worked for a second, and now it's not working. Nothing works." "What do you mean nothing works?" "Nothing works. You better get up here." So I got on a plane. I go up there, and I get there, and I pull the cover off the ECU, and the main power trace was just blown on it. And I'm looking at it, I said, you blew up the power trace. I said, "It looks like you hooked up the battery backwards on this or something." He said, "Yeah, that's the reverse polarity test. That's the second one we do." OEMs do that. You ever know that all OEM components have to be set up to be protected, so if the end customer hooks up his battery backwards, that it doesn't damage the components. So that was another change we had to institute into our deal. So all of our systems are protected against reverse polarity voltage and everything. I never would have thought about that. Who the heck hooks up battery cables backwards? OEMs do. But those things were good learning experiences for us that allowed us to bring into the aftermarket the things we had to learn. The tuition was awfully expensive, but we learned a lot. It was good. Questions on some things? Nothing.
Does your controller do pulse width modulation on those compressors?
Yep. Yeah, it's pulse width modulation on that. And that's a square wave. Driven by a square wave on that. Take a few things away today. One of them is think about a brushless fan as you're moving forward, because they really are a huge step forward. We have a 19-inch brushless fan that's 850 watts. I mean, that thing is a bruiser. And I hadn't seen anything yet that had enough radiator capacity that wouldn't cool. And we use them all the time for that. Okay. Questions on just system operation? We'll kind of do a few things here. These are some of these things, cars I looked at one time. I had one guy telling me that his AC case was sweating like crazy. He said, you guys left out the insulation. This AC case is sweating like crazy all the time. I was in the booth. I told him, I said, the only two things that's going to cause condensation like that, two things: temperature differential and humidity. That's what causes it. You know, that's what a koozies for. You know, you're keeping that off. Otherwise, if you take a can, you set it out, you're going to get condensation because it's colder on the inside than it is the outside. Humidity in the air, you get condensation. Same way with an AC case, but we insulate them. I walked out to look at his car and I had to take a picture. That's the engine compartment. He had cut a hole in his firewall and the unit was in there and he mounted it with expanding foam. If I told you that, you'd never believe it. That's why I had to take a picture.
Dear Lord.
Yes. Yes. This goes back to the hat. This goes back to the hat. Yeah, that was a winner. That was a winner. In that packet you've got there, there's a bunch of little tips. You can throw this in the top of your toolbox and use it sometime when you're thinking about this. And there's some tips right here that are really good. Now that you understand how air conditioning works, that you're absorbing heat from the air and then dissipating that heat outside, right? When you're choosing an evaporator for your car, if it's not one of our SureFit kits that we've already done all the work for you, if you're using Builder Series components for your car and you go to choose an evaporator, which one would you choose? The biggest one, right? Because you have a coil that's absorbing heat. The bigger the coil, the more heat absorption capacity it has. So you want to use the largest evaporator you can. The same thing with a condenser. You want to use the largest heat exchanger you can if you're mapping out a system on your own. That's always going to be the case. Mount solid and level. Pay attention to the drain hole and tube. Seal and insulate your car. Another thing on here, stretch duct hose to eliminate ribbing and reduce turbulence. I had a guy telling me one time how that the air just wasn't as good as it should be on the car. He had another one that had better airflow and everything. I walked out and we sent 8 feet of duct hose with this, and this guy was going to make sure he used every inch of that 8 foot we sent him. That duct hose went up, it went down under his steering column, then it came back up again, went over some wiring, went back down, and then went over to his louver. And I took it off and cut about 2 feet off it and stretched it nice and smooth and made a nice transition, and I said, see the difference? Man, that's a whole lot better. Yeah. You know, air will take the path of least resistance. So you got to keep that in mind. Another thing that I see all the time, if you're using one of our systems that has, say, 4 ducts or 3, California guys were the worst at this. I'd go out there, they'd have 32 Fords, and they would use our Mini or our Compact that had 3 outlets on the top of it. They were only going to use 2. So what they did is cap the center one. Well, by capping the center one, they thought they're going to get more airflow out of the other 2. But that's not what happens. You've got a case that's designed for proper airflow with all 3 of those vents open. By capping that, they reduced the airflow through all of them because of all the turbulence they created from that hole being capped where the air was trying to get out. So if you're not going to use every outlet on a system, just take a piece of duct hose and dump it on your feet or do something like that so that you get good airflow out of all of those outlets. They're set up so that they'll work together when they're all hooked up. Okay? All right, and the other thing that'll do is, depending on which one you plug, if it's where the probe is for the thermostat or for the ECU that's measuring coil temperature, you get an improper measurement there. So that's the other reason not to do it. Another big tip, physics. Cold air drops, hot air rises, right? How many times have we been told that? Cold air drops, hot air rises. When you're putting an AC system in a car, your aim is always going to be put those vents as high as you can so that you feel the airflow out of them, because that's the way you're going to cool yourself off first, is with airflow directly on you. Then you can kind of steer it away. But get them as high as you can. I know we all want to hide the vents so you can't see them under the dash, but if you can't see them, you probably can't feel the air coming out of them. And what you'll end up with is ice cold legs and not a real cool car. Another suggestion I always give to guys when they're working on a car, we talked about sealing and insulating your vehicle, right? That's one of the first things we talked about. One of the most common things I'll see too is holes in a firewall that never got filled. That's letting hot engine air in real quick. What I used to do when I was doing installations all the time, I had a really bright light back then. I'd put it up under the dash, shut all the lights off in the shop, and then open the hood. And the car was always up on a lid, jacked up. And I would go, if you see light anywhere coming out from that bright light, hot air can get in there too. And then I'd do just the opposite. I'd put that really bright light up under the dash and go and see if I could see light under the car coming out somewhere. Because if it's leaking light, it's going to leak air. That's a good way to determine if you've got any air leaks. Man, this was really common in Tri-5 Chevys. They have a big old hole for the brake rod to go through into the master cylinder, and over time that seal just disintegrates over time, and a lot of people, and now you've got that blowing right on you underneath that steering column. So that's a real common thing in a lot of the older cars like that. Then I'm going to close basically with 134A refrigerant. You got to use the right amount of it. 134A is extremely charge sensitive. If you don't use the right amount of it, you're not going to be happy with the results. So if you don't have a way to properly scale it, please take it to somebody that's experienced with charging the vintage air system, has either a charging station or a quality scale to be able to do that. And Ben, you can recommend people here do that all the time that are used to doing that. And we'll also get guys, when we're talking about charging, before you charge a system, it has to be evacuated, right? Y'all probably heard that. You have to evacuate the system before you charge it. Evacuation does two things. Number one, it pulls the air out of the system. Get all your air out of the system. But the more important thing evacuation does is it puts that system under a vacuum, 30 inches of vacuum. And by doing that, you lower the boiling point of water. So when you're doing installations here, again, you're similar to what we are. It's very humid here. So when you're putting these AC hoses on, you're building your AC hoses and put them on, you've got good humid air in there. So you want to make sure that you evacuate that system properly and boil that moisture out, because that'll degrade performance of the system if you have moisture in there. So you want to make sure you do that.
If you got 5-foot-long AC hoses on your machine,
You mean refrigerant lines?
you add 2 more tenths, because when I recover off after shutting the nails off, I pulled 3 tenths off the line.
Yeah, it depends. And again, when I was doing installations, I would play with the charge on a tenth at a time and see what it did, because a lot of times you can do that. If you do 1.7 to 1.8 in 90% of the cases, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine with that. But a lot of guys, what I'll run into, and you charge systems so you know, a lot of guys, they'll put in 1.8, but they don't pull in, if they're using gauges, they don't empty the hose. So they're actually a little low, which is, I'd rather have a little low than a little high. I'd rather have a little bit low than a little high. Yeah. Okay, what else question-wise? Yes?
Do you all offer the electric compressor without
We at this point do not have. We're experimenting with some in some places. Here's the problem with an electric compressor. Electric compressors have their place, but this particular market is very difficult, and I'll tell you why. Teslas and all of them that are using electric compressor, what voltages are they? 400 to 480. So if you...
I saw a few on old trucks and stuff.
Yep.
That were using them.
Yep.
I didn't know if they got them.
Yeah, no, there's plenty of them available. God, Chinese compressors, they're everywhere. And you'll see these ads, I see them all the time, this electric, $500 you can buy a whole system and everything like that. And if you're in Maine or something like that and you've only got 70 degrees you're trying to cool, the problem with most of those AC compressors, when you get to 12 volts, if you got 400 volts, y'all heard of Ohm's law? Anybody ever heard of Ohm's law? Ohm's law is V equals IR. Voltage equals current times resistance. Okay? If you got 400 volts, you don't need a lot of current to get good performance. If you drop that 400 to 12, the I has to go way up. What's the I? Current. So what you end up needing is about 175, 180 amps to run a compressor like that to give you the ones we've seen and tested, because we have a wind tunnel, to give you about 4,500 BTUs of capacity.
Toyota's been used in a long time on the hybrids.
Yep. Our Gen 5 Magnum Max that's in all our SureFit kits, it's about 20,000 BTUs. So now you got a compressor that's capable of giving you, supplying 4,500 BTUs, trying to supply a system that's worth. So you see all these systems that you see on eBay and stuff like that, it's a little bitty underdash system because it doesn't have a whole lot of BTU capability. So you can get, but you've still got to be able to give it 150 amps. I had one guy I went back and forth with who said, I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm going to run electric compressor. And you're not going to prove me wrong. He ended up putting 2 alternators on the car. I said, why not just put a belt-driven compressor? Oh, I don't want to see those hoses. I said, okay, so, but you're still up against that same thing. We are experimenting with them. They're ways of getting them better, and you know, again, like the alternators we use on our front runners are 170 amps. You can go up to 320 amps, but you got to have the wire size and all of that too. So we actually have got a little explanation on our website about that, why it's not the best idea for a hot rod. What I can see us doing in the future more is to have that as a supplementary system, to where you'll have a belt-driven compressor and an electric compressor, and if you want to run a little bit when the car is not running, that gets you some refrigerant moving through the system, and they'll work in parallel. And you're seeing some of these in the Class 8, the big 18-wheeler market. There's some things we're looking at as well on that. So that's the problem with an electric compressor, is just the capacity that they have available at 12 volts. You've got that capacity issue comes up. What size shirt do you wear? Large. It's the last large. That's a good question. Because we're getting more and more questions on them all the time, on electric compressors. But now again, we talked about physics at the beginning of the seminar today, right? And some of it runs the same way there. You know, that old deal about a free lunch. Ain't no such thing as a free lunch. You're paying for it somehow. And it's the same way with them. They have their place. They have their place. And there's going to be some, you know, again, that guy got to where he was. But again, in many cases, like a compressor like that, what it'll do is, again, if you got a 70-degree day, you might be able to maintain that. But boy, my car sits outside all day at Vintage Air, and I go in there and it's 110 degrees. You don't have the capacity to pull down to get rid of that heat. You just don't have that capacity. You can't move enough refrigerant to do it. Dual air. I want to talk on dual air just real quick. Everybody okay? Most of SUVs you buy and everything right now are dual AC. And you can run dual AC. I mean, the thing you got to keep in mind with dual AC is if you have 2 evaporators, you got to have a large enough compressor to move enough refrigerant for 2 evaporators. And the key is you got to have a large enough condenser to dissipate the heat you're absorbing with 2 evaporators. If you got a big vehicle like that, we've got a large monster condenser that'll handle 2 systems. You know, you just tee into that. A 709 compressor will provide enough capacity for it. A front runner compressor, a 7B10 will not, but a 709 will. You can get enough capacity to run two systems with it. So you can do a dual air in a car. Don't just throw 2 evaporators in there again and expect it to work right. There's things that come into it. What other questions? Anything else? Ben?
Man, you're killing it off. Tell us, what's the difference between the Gen 4 and the Gen 5 that's recently came out?
Gen 4 and Gen 5 differences. Man, we are really proud of our Gen 5 system. If you've not put in one of our Gen 5s yet, it is the next generation from the Gen 4. And again, we talked about doing the Ford GT. We took a lot of the knowledge we gained doing the Ford GT in our Gen 5 system. That's a injection molded plastic case. That's an OEM quality case on a Gen 5. Plus the Magnum Max, the one we're using that just about every SureFit now, the blower motor is 20% more capacity than the Gen 4 blower, larger blower. That makes a big difference. And I'll tell you where it makes it. What I noticed the biggest difference on, because I had a Gen 4 in my Monte Carlo and then put the Gen 5 in there with the bigger blower motor on it. And the good thing about that bigger blower motor is it's 20% higher capacity through the entire blower curve. And that's a fancy way of saying at every speed there's 20% more capacity. So what I find myself doing now is I used to have to run that Gen 4 on max a lot of the time. Now, when I go to lunch or something like that, I'll run it on max for 3, 4, 5 minutes to pull down the temperature inside the car, and I'm cutting it back to half, and it's a lot quieter because you're only running it at half speed, so it's quieter. So that's one of the big difference about it. We've got a lot of new systems out there. Another thing we're getting into, I don't know if y'all are interested in this at all, but we're getting into Jeep systems. I mean, we're doing SureFit kits now for Jeep, CJ5, CJ7, CJ8, YJ, Wagoneers. Working with a guy that's made like a Pro Street Wagoneer. That's a pretty cool vehicle. LS and Roadster shop chassis and all of that and everything. Pretty cool little two-door Wagoneer he's doing. Cherokee, I guess, is not a Wagoneer, but so a lot of new stuff. Again, y'all are really fortunate to have such a good shop here that keeps abreast of all these new parts. We've got new control panels out all the time and all of that. You know, Ben and the guys here are really good about staying up with those things and everything.